Good afternoon. My name is Susan Pharr, and I'm director of the program on U.S.-Japan relations, and it is a great privilege to welcome you to this symposium this afternoon on the origins of prosperity and stability, state building in Asia in the 20th century. It is an event that is, we are fortunate to host it from the Japan Institute of International Affairs, which has joined us today with a delegation. And so it is co-sponsored by the Program on U.S.-Japan Relations and JIIA. And it's also sponsored by the Harvard Asia Center and Harvard's Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies. I wonder if I can begin with a little story that gets to the heart of some of the things we'll be talking about today. If you recall, Taiwan underwent its transition to democracy in 1987, and around 1988 or 1899, the Center for International Affairs, whose director was Samuel Huntington, received an invitation to send a Harvard delegation to a conference in Taipei at Taiwan National on democratization in Taiwan. So there were about 6 Harvard professors led by Professor Samuel Huntington, all of us going to this conference in Taipei. So we met early in the morning at Logan Airport, and it's about 6 a.m., so we're all wearing our track clothes for the long flight or jeans or whatever. And we all start getting on the plane, and we're going into economy class, and we notice Professor Huntington has disappeared. But so maybe he's been bumped up to another level, fair enough. And then we arrive in Taipei, and we're sitting in the airport. The plane is stopped on the tarmac, and the faculty who are sitting in the plane began to look outside, and we see a very interesting thing. We see some people coming out from the airport with a red carpet that they're unrolling, and they unroll it all the way to the plane and up the steps of the plane. And then out comes Professor Huntington in a pinstripe suit. And we notice outside the airport, they have erected a platform. And there are hundreds of people around this platform and many journalists. And there's a lot of activity. And as we sit inside the plane, we watch Professor Huntington give a speech to all these people who've come to the airport to greet him. So what was this about? This was about a scholar getting recognition for a book he had written and an argument he had made. And what the book had said, and this is a book even now read in political science, places like Harvard, a book called Political Order in Changing Societies. But in the book he says, citizens may push for democratization. But however, everything depends on the political institutions in the country. If they are weak, the efforts of the citizens will fail, and there will be coup d'etat or such results. However, if the political institutions are strong, the result will be democratization. So this was a conference that had been sponsored by the political party in Taiwan that had overseen the process of the democratic transition. And therefore, honoring Professor Huntington, and he was the honored guest of the Taiwan Political Science Association and received a prize. It allowed the KMT, the Kuomintang, which had to swallow the bitter pill of democratization, to step forward and take credit for it, for that democratization. In other words, they had exactly the kind of strong state that had led to democracy in Taiwan. So this is the kind of issue we're looking at by looking at states and state building and why we have those strong institutions in Asia. Strong states command the power to coerce, but they also have the power to lead to economic prosperity and also to stability. And these are the kinds of relationships we're looking at today. It is an honor for me now to join me in welcoming you, Director General Yasunori Nakayama, who heads the delegation from JIIA. It's a privilege.
Dr. Susan Pharr and Dr. Akihiko Tanaka and Consul General Michi, distinguished scholars, and ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for attending today's symposium entitled Origins of Prosperity and Stability, State Building in 20th Century Asia. This symposium will present the findings of a research program that the Japan Institute of International Affairs, or JIIA, what we call, began 3 years ago, and focusing on the history of 20th century Asia. And Professor Akihiko Tanaka, the president of Tokyo-based National Graduate Institute for Policy Study, or the GRIPS, has been leading a group of about 25 scholars from many nations who have been engaging in ambitious attempt to reanalyze the history of 20th century Asia from the perspective of state building and international relations. In turbulent times like today, it is vital to continue making efforts to enhance mutual understanding and trust among nations. In the context of international relations surrounding Japan, it has been pointed out that the people of East Asia must take a step forward by overcoming antagonisms caused by differences in how they view history. In order to do that, it is vital to carry out historical research from objective and contextualized perspectives that will allow us to get a better grip on the facts. In the long run, the sharing such research findings will allow us to build mutual understanding and trust among members of the international community, and will contribute to stability in international relations. This program seeks to present comprehensive perspectives on Asian history through comparative and trans-regional research. And we are also planning to share our findings by publishing a report compiling theses written by all the scholars participated, both in Japanese and English. So we're delighted to be able to present the result of our program at this symposium. And we are particularly grateful for our co-host, Dr. Susan Pharr, the Edwin Reischauer Professor of Japanese Politics and the Director of Weatherhead Center for International Affairs, the program on US-Japan relations at the Harvard University. We hope that this symposium would provide an excellent opportunity for an active exchange of ideas among all participants today. Thank you very much.
In my enthusiasm for the event, I neglected to properly introduce Nakayama-san. He has been Director General of JIIA. He received his bachelor's degree from University of Tokyo, and he has been Senior Policy Coordinator in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in the Foreign Policy Bureau. And may I just mention, he's had many distinguished posts, but until quite recently, he was Consul General in Toronto. So let me now turn to our keynote speaker. It is a great privilege to introduce a very old friend, Akihiko Tanaka, who is now president of the National Graduate Institute of Policy Studies in Tokyo, which is often known by its acronym GRIPS. He received his bachelor's degree from the University of Tokyo, his PhD from MIT. And he is a leading scholar of Japan's international relations, Japan-East Asian relations, and also theories of international politics. He was professor of international politics in the Institute of Advanced Studies on Asia in the University of Tokyo. He served as executive vice president of University of Tokyo and then president of Japan's International Cooperation Agency, JICA. It was much noted in the press at the time. He was appointed in 2012 to a position that normally wouldn't have gone to a scholar, so it was received a great deal of attention in Japan, and he served very ably in that post up until 2015. He's the author of numerous books on world politics, just to mention one of the most recent, Japan in Asia, Post-Cold War Diplomacy, published in 2017. He'll be speaking on origins of prosperity and stability, state building in the 20th century, and introduce our topic. So we turn things over to Professor Tanaka. May I just go, perhaps in the interest of continuity, I will go ahead and introduce the distinguished discussant we have, who is Thomas Berger. He will follow the presentation about Professor Tanaka. He is a professor of international relations in the School of Global Studies at Boston University, and he's director of Boston University's Center for the Study of Asia. He received his bachelor's degree from Columbia, and he, like our keynote speaker, received a PhD from MIT. So MIT is getting a lot of recognition today. And just again, the little booklet that you have gives bios, so I will not go into detail, but simply mention a book he did on cultures of anti-militarism, national security in Germany and Japan, and a prize-winning book, War, Guilt, and World Politics After World War II. So I will now turn things over to Professor Tanaka, and then Professor Berger will follow.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you, Susan, for a kind introduction. It is my great pleasure to be back at Harvard. Extremely happy because sometimes at Harvard, I'm able to see my old Japanese friends whom I have a rare opportunity to see in Japan. Also, really a privilege to explain and justify the project that we are going to do in this very academic atmosphere. My presentation is not a conclusion. It's beginning questions or that somehow try to justify what we are doing. The main body of our finding contents will come in the panel discussion by the authors of respective chapters. I would like to start with some slides, figures, somehow to try why we are doing this. The first is the changing share of GDP by region in the world since 1820. The data is a very famous data started to be created by Professor Angus Maddison and updated by the Madison Database project. And out of that, I calculated the share of GDP. And then, as you see, it's now quite familiar that in 1820, the share of China, India is very big. And then, but then the 19th century indicates the rise of the West, Western Europe, US, and these blue shades goes up. And then if you include Eastern Europe, that goes further up. In the middle of 20th century, the share of the broad sense the West constitute nearly 75% of the GDP. The reverse side of the story is the decline of the share of GDP of Asia. And then in 1950, the share of China was just 5%, in contrast to the 30-some percent in 1820. But then things have changed since the 1950, and then the share of Asia gradually increased, and then by 2016, that's the last year that the Madison Database Project estimates it goes up nearly to 50%. The second slide is, again, a very familiar story of the rise of living standard of East Asian countries. This is, again, the per capita GDP data is also from the Madison database projects. But this indicates in the 1950s, 60s, per capita GDP of many of Asian countries were very, very low, or the less than 1,000. When Professor Gunnar Myrdal wrote Asian dramas, the Asia was regarded as one of the poorest regions in the world, sometimes characterized as poorer than sub-Saharan Africa. But as we all know, the per capita GDP of Japan goes up, but then closely following that, Hong Kong's per capita GDP goes up, following Japan's, and then Singapore, Taiwan's. This is the 10,000, and actually this is Singapore goes all the way now. But I just cut off the level by 10,000, and then if you follow this, virtually all East Asian economies will grow very rapidly, and till by now, this Indonesia, China, Philippines, according to the Madison database projects, the per capita GDP is calculated as purchasing power parity in 2011 dollars. Nearly all of them reach 10,000. So this is the condition of prosperity in East Asia. Now, the other part of our title, stability, is often measured by how war-prone the region is. This is the data from Uppsala University's conflict database. Indicates the number of wars that caused more than 1,000 deaths per year. And then the red one is the wars that took place in East Asia. The other is the entire world. And in the 1950s to sometime around 1970s, 80s, the percentage of war within the global wars, the percentage in Asia is extremely high. But since 1980 or so, only one or two or three. And then as we enter 21st century, we had only one war in 2000, which was the Mindanao conflict in the Philippines. But then other than that, virtually no wars in Asia now. Well, actually, following the same database, there are probably more precise counting of battle-related deaths by Uppsala University's database, which is this. Only from 1989, the battle-related death globally was very high in the early 1990s and went down, and then in 1990, 2000, it went up again. It's because of Ethiopia and the conflict. And then went down, but then by the 2012, mainly as a result of Syrian civil war and others, it went up quite high now. But the number of war-related deaths in Asia, depicted by red, is this small. So at least as far as these war data is concerned, East Asia is quite peaceful. Another slide, or two following slides, I would like to talk a bit about political system that Asia has. This is the figure. I put all countries in the world on the two-dimensional space, defined first by the Human Development Index. The index that is provided by UNDP, the United Nations Development Agency program, indicating not just GDP per capita, but education and life expectancy is a composed index. And then vertically, it's defined by the degree of freedom as measured by Freedom House. And so if you go to the right up-hand corner, there are countries with a very high living standard as well as high political freedom. And then lower and low living standard with a very unfree political system. And then if you put Asian countries on this two-dimensional space, you have very diverse distribution. Japan, South Korea, Hong Kong, Taiwan, around this area. But then here, the Philippines, Malaysia, Singapore, Brunei, Indonesia, China, Vietnam, Laos, and Myanmar in 1995. This has undergone several changes over the following 2 decades. This indicates this. This is the location in 2015. And as we see, Indonesia was located somewhere around here in 1995, but it went up toward the right-hand side corner. So Indonesia's trajectory follows what most modernization theorists indicates, from poor and not free condition to more freer and more prosperous condition toward this right upward movement. But as you see from these 2 changes, interesting thing is that a lot of countries move just simply to the right. So become more prosperous without becoming freer. And the typical one is this huge country with this. The circle indicates the size of GDP. So from here, you have China here with smaller GDP, and movement toward right with growing GDP. And so we saw out of these figures that Asia has become very, very prosperous and peaceful, but political systems continue to be as diverse as before. Some indicate the correctness of modernization theory. Some appear to challenge this view by giving examples of becoming prosperous without becoming free. How durable these conditions? Actually, we don't know. Prosperity may end. Many countries may enter into a situation called a middle income trap, or peace may become vulnerable, or may end as we are beginning to worry about North Korean conditions, or in the implication of the rise of China and the power shift. And then, of course, a political system may not be as diverse as this. We do not know how China moves from here. Continues to move this way, or may follow the pattern of some of these things, move toward this. I think these future will be open. But I think for the purpose of this project, what we would like to know are why we have this kind of East Asia. If you are the follower of democratic peace theory, you can explain the peace by pointing out that all members of the regions are democratic countries, like in EU. But the East Asia consists of many countries, liberal democracies, but non-liberal entities, authoritarian countries. At least we would like to know why and how this happened. By posing this kind of question, we may be able to provide a new way to look at the history of Asia in the 20th century. I have the impression that history of Asia written in the past or in the long past tend to be reflected by the assumption that West's upward movement continues forever, and Asia's downward movements continues forever. The modern version or of the Marxist Asiatic mode of production. From the viewpoint of 21st century, where we know that Asia has become prosperous, peaceful, without becoming liberal democratic, we should reconsider how we write the history of Asia. I would like to hastily add that ours is not a theory-driven history. I, as an editor, ask each participant, who are the experts on their country and their region and the period, to describe and analyze how each country make this type of achievement possible. How each country and region come to arrive at the situation where I just showed from these slides. However, I suggested that the two theoretical concepts, which I think Susan just introduced to us. One is the role of the state, and the other, the role of the international environment or international relations. In some sense, very simplistically, at least I had the impression that the declining period of Asia appears to have corresponded with the weakening of the state in these regions. And it seems that the rising phase of Asia appears to indicate the growing strength of the state in each part. Of course, the strength of the state is a notion that may pose theoretical difficulties defining conceptually as well as empirically. But in my current own understanding, the strength of the state may be defined as an ability to maintain both internal and external equilibria of the society. When the state cannot maintain the internal equilibrium, the country may tumble into civil wars or chaotic politics and the stagnation. When the state cannot maintain the external equilibrium, it may be conquered or it may be transformed into a colony, or it may be devastated by the outside aggression. And so we need to pay attention to both the function of the state to maintain internal equilibrium and also external equilibrium. The history in this very simplistic scheme indicates these changing ability of the state in response to the international environment. Particularly the ability to maintain external equilibrium is not defined only by the state alone. It is a function of the state capability and the condition of the international environment. And if the international environment is quite benign, then smaller capability to maintain external equilibrium may not bring about disaster. But if the international environment was extremely malicious, then even a fairly capable state may find it hard to maintain external equilibrium. I want the experts, including the panelists, to flesh out details of such state building in their own description and analysis. And simply put, at least as far as I'm concerned, state building within a dynamically changing international relations appear to be the key to analyze the history of 20th century Asia. Thank you very much. Thank you.
So we'll now turn to Professor Berger, who will offer some remarks as the discussant.
Well, thank you very much. It's an honor to be here, and thanks to Susan and Shin for inviting me again. Also, I want to both thank and apologize to my classmate, senpai from MIT. I actually participated in an early version of this project in Tokyo, I think a little over a year ago, and I dropped out both because of my own laziness, but also because I realized I just don't have the historical knowledge that is required. Shikaku ga nai kara. I just dropped out. But I will nonetheless boldly offer a few observations in response to Professor Tanaka's extremely interesting observations, 3 observations actually, and hopefully I won't demonstrate just how unqualified I am to speak on these issues in the process. But I mean, the 3 points which I'll just briefly touch on is what I call the problems of purpose, a problem of periodization, and a preference for fine-grained analysis. The problem of purpose, I very much, by the way, appreciated. I read the paper a couple of times very carefully. There's a lot of information in it. I very much appreciated the felicitous observation that Tanaka-san and Ambassador Nogami made, that history emerges out of a conversation between the past and the present. That is, history does not understand itself. We always write history for our own times. And I think that's very important and very true. But let me just expand on that. And when we look at history, we write it not only from the perspective of the present in an analytical sense, we also write out of it from a prescriptive sense. There's both a purpose to history as well as a historical perspective. And many of the arguments which Tanaka-san makes I agree with, but I somehow found myself feeling uncomfortable. I was trying to identify why I feel uncomfortable with them, probably because of my Western biases. But yeah, I mean, look, the notion that Marxist, Weberian, and modernization theory do not perfectly explain what's gone on in Asia is absolutely true. And likewise, the notion that institutions and institution building is important again, strikes me as important, as something that we should be recognized. But Sam Huntington made it. JIIA-WCFIA, this Joint Center on Political Development, which some of our professors, Myron Weiner and Lucian Pai, helped run together with Sam Huntington, emphasize these factors. And I have no problem with that. But let me just ask, what's the purpose? And I'm sure this is not the purpose you intended. But what is the purpose? What purposes does this particular interpretation of history lead us to? I mean, there is a kind of ASEAN way argument. That is, we can have a lot of diverse different institutions. They can live together in peace and prosperity, and we shouldn't get too excited about, conforming to some sort of externally defined model. However, if you go down that path, it seems there are at least 3 little problems with that. One, of course, is it discounts what, to me, is one of Japan's greatest achievements, right? The achievement of a stable democratic order. In the process, it also discounts the achievements of other Asian countries who also happen to be US allies. The ROK, Philippines, and Taiwan. Secondly, it undermines one of the key legitimations for US policy in East Asia. Again, I'm a problem-oriented political scientist. I mean, American foreign policy, of course, has a realist component. We are concerned with our interests in defending our security and economic interests in the region. But to really get a stable policy approach to any region in the world, we have to combine it to our ideals. And those ideals, and this again is an American bias of mine, has to be linked to democracy. So an order which is not including that as a central element in it will be difficult for us to sign on to. And finally, it feeds into lots of new theories, which are also serving purposes, which are emerging, especially in China. And we get lots of this reminds me of some of the things I was hearing in Tsinghua University and Beijing University about the Asian pattern of international relations and development, and how that democracy is not important in Asia. Not only is it not important, it might even be alien. So I just found myself on this sort of purposive ground a little bit uncomfortable. This also brings me to this other problem which I was having, which is the problem of periodization, a well-known problem in historiography. Where do you begin your story? Where do you end it? Always changes your perspective. And the chart by Angus Madison, which I've seen before, and you also had an extended version, so it actually goes from 1700 all the way out very boldly to 2030. And you see even more clearly a kind of arc of great and powerful Asia declining, and right, then re-emerging, with the West disappearing in relative terms or declining in relative terms. Now, again, I think there's a lot to this. Yeah, I mean, that's in fact the way the world is. But I've seen that chart before. When I look at my Chinese colleagues who are arguing that we are now reverting to a normal state of affairs. And this is usually tied, and I'm sure Professor Perkins has encountered this many times, with the notion that we're going to be returning to, in East Asia, to a kind of Sinocentric. I know this is absolutely not your intention, but to a, I know Tanaka-san very well. This is not his agenda. But it easily fits into a kind of Sinocentric worldview. I think the sort of academically respectable version of it is David Kang, who's has sort of proposed this, in which we've got this sort of benign Fa Mulan universe with this sort of friendly China in the middle, constructively building things around it. I think in this also context, when I take a look and you have this puzzle which we've all been wrestling with for a long time. How the heck did Europe pull so far ahead? And this actually kind of ties into the problem also of the scope, periodization, but also scope. And I think lots of historians and sociologists, historical sociologists, people like Jared Diamond, people like Charles Tilley in some ways, people like John Hall up into McGill, when they look at this, the unit of analysis is not some sort of reified East versus West, Asia versus Europe. The unit of analysis are patterns of cooperation which build across the sort of cartographer's artificially defined boundaries of regions. And what becomes very interesting, I think also historically the works of Janet Abu-Lughod, now being also talking about Europe before the West, but the whole pattern across the Eurasian landmass of communication, the exchange of ideas, of knowledge, of resources, going back to the Han Dynasty and to the Roman dynasty, creating a slow-moving division of labor and build-up of a store of knowledge, which made possible what we now call modernity. Later scholars would call modernity. And in fact, if you were sort of looking at the Earth around, from space, around 1200, 1300, you could see that the whole Eurasian landmass, including parts of the Middle East, were pregnant with what we now call industrialization and modernization. The question was, where is it going to break through first? It could have been Song Dynasty China. I mean, tremendous accomplishments. Might have been perhaps even Japan. It could have been in southern India. But it happened to be in the West. And the answer for why it happened in the West, now this takes me to what I still think is, and now, by the way, since we both were studying with Sam Huntington and Lucian Pai, and I'm sort of feeling this burst of youthful vigor, so I'm going to go back to some of this. But there are certain mechanisms that we've identified, mechanisms of the market, mechanisms of competition politically as well as economically, as well as ideas. And in the West, because of historically contingent factors, the fractured nature of the Western political order, we happen to be, first. Lucky, as my Japanese friends' teenage children would put it. The United States was, not the United States, Europe was lucky to have been ahead. And that allowed for an enormous explosion. When these same mechanisms, when these same patterns of knowledge and organizing things transferred themselves to East Asia, first in Japan, and then again other Asian countries, we saw the same catching up factor. So again, if you take a look at a different periodization and you take a look at it differently in terms of the unit of analysis, and you bring back some of these mechanisms which may have led to this rapid development, it makes sense. It's not a unique Asian or regional paradigm. It's one that fits in a broad sense. Now, again, modernization theory, the Marxist notion of an Asiatic mode of production, the cultural elements of Weber, also translated by Eric Voegelin, well, they also served purposes. They were kind of a Western glorification, notion of a sort of teleological march, the West is better. Sure, we can reject that. But some of the basic ideas, these mechanisms, I think account for a lot of what explains the difference between East and West. And now this brings us to the more important sort of contemporary question. What now? Modernization theory really, and Sam Huntington's Political Order in Changing Society, which Susan pointed to, talks about what we see as a result of industrialization, what we see as a result of the social and economic changes which are created by the process of the creation of modern societies, leads to a change in the social structure, the emergence of a middle class, and a demand, right, by this empowered middle class for greater say over their life, greater participation. This is what Huntington referred to as the political participation revolution. And if we look at East Asia over the last 50 years, we see it. We see it. The exceptions is Singapore, which is fine-tuned and small. It's a perfect soft authoritarian government. I wouldn't give it too many decades if my still old-fashioned view of the world is right. And of course, China is finally getting to that point. And one of the things we're seeing, and the Chinese statistics don't allow us to see it fully because they stopped counting mass incidents. They reduced our ability to report on it. But there is increasing. I see it with my Chinese students. I see it when I talk to people. I don't speak Chinese, but people in China, the sense I get is that there's increased dissatisfaction with the lack of say in everyday life. It doesn't mean we want to get rid of the Chinese Communist Party. It doesn't mean we want elections. It means we'd like less corruption. We'd like less pollution. And it's out of those kinds of things which we may see, again, modernization theory leading to a participation revolution and shifting the world. This is the theory I'd like to believe. It's also one that helps serve the purposes of American foreign policy and strengthening the US-Japanese alliance, a purpose which I'm sure Tanaka-san and many of our other friends from Japan can agree on. So with those words and thoughts, I'll just step down and hopefully have not totally disqualified myself.
Thank you so much, Professor Berger. And now we'll have some time for some questions. We'll go to 3:10 and then we'll take a break and come back after 10 minutes. So I wonder if I could start out. Actually, I found the tables that you showed us really quite amazing because we normally don't think about Asia so much as a region, to think of it cumulatively in that way, but the degree to which there has been stability is not something that's obvious to most people. And we look at the number of battle-related deaths. That's really quite striking, Asia in comparison with other regions. But if I can just ask you about one cornerstone of your explanation is the importance of international environment. So I wonder if you could, I'm just interested because so much work on European state building has emphasized the role of external threats in pushing the process of state building. And to what degree do you believe that external threats, and you mentioned wars that have occurred along the way in Asia, Korean War, Vietnam War, to what extent have they played a role in state building, or do you think that explanation of the actual wars and in the form of external threats, that they are not so important in your story? And then we'll open it up and others can ask questions. Would you like, we'll sit.
Okay. I think on this specific and very important question of the role of war in state building, I, frankly speaking, do not have the answer, although the international environment, as we discussed during our project meeting and others, will constitute a certain type of critical juncture at which the institution buildings take shapes. Well, I think, again, I do not have elaborate theory, but the concept of critical juncture is, in my understanding, is quite open-ended. This could trigger a positive feedback or negative feedback. And so it depends upon empirical study. How each critical juncture played out. I think I think our Korean chapter includes the impact of the Korean War in the state building. But I think again, I'm no expert on Korean economy, but Korean War could make both. I think political impetus as well as negative conditions in which to create a state. Well, in some sense, the Korean War made the members of society very equal or equally poor, while it mobilized the resources that was developed in the colonial period to create a better economic development and in the form of creating Park Chung-hee government. So I think international environment can make such a difference. Also, I think the international environment, one of the example may be the Cold War. Cold War may have worked to sustain the international border that was created during the colonial period by sort of a balance of power. The involvement on the one side is deterred by the counter measure under the Cold War, the confrontation. And so I think I do not have general proposition. I think the way the critical juncture may have impact on the state building, well, depends on circumstances, which is to be, I think, clarified by the analysis of each panel. And then I would like to somehow excuse myself in leaving these questions to our panelists in the next discussion. Well, if I may make some comments to Thomas's the comments. Well, yes, I am uncomfortable as you about this pattern. But then I think this is reality, at least the way I see reality, and that we need to squarely face. Well, if only I think as a ideologue of liberal democracy would need to understand probably if only to tackle our enemy. And I don't like to be ideologically, ideological statements are in this presentation, but I really confess that I'm not comfortable with this. But this is the uncomfortable reality that we have to explain. And also, I don't believe our country chapters will simply evaluate the authoritarian paths of development. We have chapter on Taiwan, which is going to be discussed. We have chapter on Japan. We have chapter on South Korea. We have chapter on Indonesia, which are really the process of democratization, liberalization taking shape through the process of strengthening the state. And so I think that I think only justification is that we need we have a reality to make sense of, if only to realize our ideals.
So let me open it up, and if you could ask just a one-part question, because our time is sort of limited, and if you could introduce yourself. Yes, in the back row.
Hi, my name is Michael Abeli. I'm a postdoctoral fellow with the Reischauer Institute. Thank you very much for your presentation. I just had a question about this sort of focus on the state and its role in promoting economic development or ensuring equilibrium at home and abroad. if we focus on the state in this way, might it not also sort of blind us to some other issues that can impact economic development? So I'm thinking of social issues, issues of wealth inequality. So, for example, right now in the U.S., we are at a time of unprecedented GDP, or not unprecedented, but high GDP growth and high levels of wealth inequality. This, of course, has a damaging effect on democracy and participation. So I'm wondering what, you know, what impact a focus on, social relations and social divisions in these countries might have on this model. Thank you.
Well, in my understanding, the analysis based on the role of the state building, is not going to, has the privilege to dominate all kinds of explanations. I think perspective from the state perspective poses only one way, which we think promising, but that does not exclude the necessity and possibility of looking at the same reality from different perspective, like social relations. But even within this perspective of state-centered analysis, as I said in my presentation, the strength of state, in my understanding, is defined by its ability to maintain internal equilibrium as well as external equilibrium. And internal equilibrium, in my sense, is made possible by the social movements, social relations, market forces, and the interaction of the government with social relations and the market. And so, very familiar trilogy or three-way categorization: state, society, market. And in a way, this equilibrium is created by the interaction of these three. And so even from somewhat narrower perspective of state building, I think each chapter is able to discuss the impact of social relations on the state's capability. So equilibrium is created because of the balance of each strength, ability. And if social relations moves very big, then even a fairly capable state may not be able to control. Or if a state is, social relations becomes weaker, then the state may be able to impose certain results that were not desired by many in society.
Yes.
My name is Ali Makki. I'm from the Kennedy School. I'm an alum of the Kennedy School. And I wanted to focus on the role of Japan. Japan was the first to join the so-called West in terms of industrialization and modernization, and the role it has had in bringing the rest of Asia with it, through its practices in Korea and its colonial patterns, and maybe to some extent as a reaction to Japan. So going forward, if you could just talk about the role of Japan in this story that you laid out, and also going forward, what does the TPP or the relationship between Japan and China, the cooperation or lack thereof, mean to the trajectory that Asia will take in the foreseeable future? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. When we talk about the role of Japan, I think it can mean, at least from my perspective, the two things. One is the sort of type of development, or if it is to be emulated by that, it's a type or state building, the type of state building that could become useful for others. The second role is the Japan as an important dynamic mover of the international environment. I believe the Meiji state presented a one type of model that affect many Chinese or Koreans and Vietnamese to study. And then also in the post-Second World War period, Japan presented a type of state-led development or industrial policy, which probably, still there may be arguments how much, industrial policy played a role in Japan's economic development, but at least this type existed. But then if you look at the second type of impact, the Japan as a driver of the international environment, I believe Japan's war with China in 1895, Japan's war with Russia in 1905, created the environment somehow. But the Japanese believed it could annex Korean Peninsula, and as a result of Sino-Japanese War, Japan took Taiwan. Well, in my sort of terminology, Korea was not able to maintain external equilibria because of the terrible power by Japan. The Japan's aggression in the 1930s constituted a very important element of the international environment that affected virtually entire East Asia, as we now call. The impact could be terrible, and then some could trigger the decolonization. Well, certainly the defeat of Japan decolonized South Korea and Taiwan. So I think we could describe and present a story of Japan's role, at least in these two ways.
One final question. Yes. Oh, go.
My name is Tomoko Okagaki. I'm with the Weatherhead Scholars Program. I wonder if the origins of prosperity and origin of stability are the same. I wonder if we should think about them separately. When it is stability, I think of U.S. Alliances, the security alliances that U.S. provided in the Cold War structure. And when it is prosperity, I think of domestic industrial policies that Asian countries had. And I don't know if you have any thought on this. I mean, I wonder if we should think of them separately.
Did I respond?
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, in fact, I haven't really clarified exact origins of this, and I simply raised the questions: where are the origins? And I think the process of state building and the dynamically changing international environment, the location where some of the origins you may be able to find. One, small, I think, the point about peace in Asia. Certainly some region, peace of Japan is, I believe, contributed very much by the U.S. alliance. But then the time of U.S. alliance also corresponded, at least in the first half, with a very frequent wars in Asia. The Korean War, Vietnam War, and other civil wars. And the latter part, we had virtually no interstate wars, and that may partly be explained by the U.S. alliance, but U.S. alliance may not be the only source of stability.
Yes.
Yeah. So yeah, thank you for your excellent presentation. So yeah, this is Zeng Wu from Boston University.
Can you speak directly into your microphone?
You know? Okay. Yes. Stand up. Okay. So actually, I'm starting with Professor Berger. So after his comment and your presentation, I have some I agree with you actually in terms of the importance of external environment for the kind of modernization of Asia in particular. But I was wondering which part of the international environment is important there. So you were saying that whether it is malicious or benign plays a role here, right? But I think actually, I'm not sure whether it is the fact that whether it is malicious or benign plays a role here, or I was trying to identify which part of the international environment would play a role. And Professor Rosenberger Professor Berger went back to the history, saying that maybe back into Europe or the Western society, those market mechanism would be important, and Europe was lucky somehow to have this mechanism. But I also have a question for that. Where is the market mechanism from? Why Europe have that kind of particular mechanism which can lead us to modernity or to a different ways of development? But is this market mechanism very important for the internal environment for Asia, which leads Asia to modernization?
Thank you.
I wasn't able to follow the questions.
We have a limited amount of time, so why don't you respond to which part?
Well, the reason why I use such a broad word called the international environment is because, again, because this is a history project, and this is not sort of a very narrow political science application of hypothesis to a very specific by case studies. It's I think international environment can create many things which you may not be may not anticipated, and so I tend to become as broad as possible. And the what function as a critical juncture for one country may be totally different from for other countries, and so I cannot really answer which part of the international environment is most important.
Did you want to say something about TPP?
Oh yeah, I forgot to mention the TPP. This is not much, within the scope of this project. But I think, and again, it's my policy preference. Well, somebody has to maintain the multilateral liberal international order, and currently, Mr. Trump does not appear to be much interested in multilateral trade system, and so I think the role of Europe, the role of Japan, the role of Canada, Australia, and those countries who consider the multilateral trade system to be their own the best interest should continue the efforts by enacting TPP 11, even without the US, so that we may be able to welcome U.S. again in the next administration or the administration after the next, but I don't know. But I think that's what Japan should do.
So we're at a very good stopping point. We'll now take a break and come back, please, in 10 minutes. We'll resume. Thank you so much to both to our presenter and to our discussant. Would you join me in thanking them?